The snow fell like tiny knives on Billis 9. Each flake cut through the bitter air, settling on metal and flesh with equal cruelty. In the scrap district, where broken dreams came to rust, two figures huddled against the endless cold. "We just want a warm meal, please," said the alien mother, her voice barely a whisper in the freezing wind. Her bare feet pressed against the icy ground as she held her daughter close. The little girl shivered, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. This wasn't the kind of cold that came and went. Billis 9. Winter lived in your bones. It crawled through cracks and walls, slipped under doors like an unwanted visitor, and made itself at home in every corner. The wind didn't howl here, it whispered death. Instead, there was only the steady hum of old machines working too hard, the distant crash of metal being moved around the freight depot, and the soft crackling sound of ice forming on every surface near the edge of the scrap district, where forgotten ships came to die. Two collapsed loading ramps leaned against each. Other like tired old friends, between them and a rusted waste crusher that hadn't worked in years, a woman knelt in the snow. Her knees pressed into the frozen ground, and her hands shook from more than just the cold dot. Her name was Corinne Valloon. She was 31 years old, though the hard life had aged her beyond her years. Once she had been what they called a caste consort, a woman bred and sold for having babies in the far colonies where people were scarce. The Varellan diaspora, her people, had been scattered across the galaxy like seeds in the wind. But, unlike seeds, they rarely found good soil to grow in. Corinne hadn't chosen this life. She hadn't asked to be born into a system that treated women like her as breeding stock. She certainly hadn't chosen to end up on Billis 9, this frozen wasteland at the edge of civilized space. But choices were a luxury she'd never been able to afford. After the fertility programs decided she was no longer useful, too old. They said, though 31 seemed young to her, they'd thrown her away like broken machinery, deported, cast out. Left to survive however she could, she'd landed on Billis 9 with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small child to care for, and the crushing weight of starting over with nothing. Her long white hair hung around her face like a curtain, damp from the snow and tangled from too many nights sleeping rough. Her skin was a deep violet color, beautiful once but now dulled by exhaustion and marked by the constant tension of survival. The cold had brought a faint flush to her cheeks. But it wasn't the healthy glow of warmth. It was the sting of skin slowly freezing. What she wore could barely be called clothing anymore. It was the remains of her old uniform from the breeding. program, a silver bodysuit designed to show off her body to potential buyers. Sleeveless and torn at the hips and thighs. It had never been meant to protect anyone from anything. It was made for display, like a prize animal at market. Now, after months of sleeping on cold metal and scraping by in the streets, it barely held together. The thin fabric clung to her like a second skin, showing every bruise she'd collected, every sign of the hard life she now lived. Her legs were completely bare, her feet naked against the snow. She pressed her palms down into the frozen ground. To keep from falling over, every joint in her body ached. Her back burned from crouching for so long. But she stayed there waiting, hoping someone might care enough to help. Beside her stood her daughter Za, at 5 years old. She was too young to understand why they lived like this, but old enough to feel hungry and cold and scared. She had the same violet skin as her mother, but lighter, like lavender instead of deep purple. Her hair was white like Karen's, but short and choppy. Corinne had cut it herself with a broken piece of metal when it got too tangled to manage. Zed's eyes were bright green, like little emeralds, and they darted around constantly, watching the people who walked past without looking at them. Her clothes were a patchwork of whatever Corinne could find or trade for. Market scraps, old sackcloth, anything that might keep her a little warmer. The oversized tunic hung on her tiny frame like a tent. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that were supposed to be socks. but they were so worn that her toes poked through on one foot. The cold had painted her cheeks bright red, and her nose had started to bleed from the dry, freezing air. She didn't complain, though. She'd learned that complaining didn't make things better. Instead, she just held onto her mother's arm and watched the world go by, hoping someone might stop and help them. Corinne didn't want to be here begging in the street like this. She'd tried it once before, yesterday. She'd stood with one hand out, keeping her voice steady and polite, asking for help. Most people had walked past as if she were invisible. One man had grabbed her arm. She'd seen something ugly in his eyes, something that made her pull away fast and grab Za's hand to run. Za had cried that night, sensing her mother's fear without understanding it. Today, Corinne wasn't begging with words. She was just there, waiting, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would see them and feel something human stir in their chest. Someone who might remember what it felt like to be helpless and cold and afraid. Across the narrow alley, behind a heavy steel door that was cracked open just a few inches, a man stood watching them. His name was Roger Venn. He was 33 years old, human, and tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Roger had once been a terraforming engineer, one of those people who turned dead planets into places where humans could live. It was important. Work, dangerous work, but work that mattered. He'd had a team of good people working with him, people he'd trusted with his life every day. Then came the accident on a mining moon, when a pressure system failed and everything went wrong in the space of a heartbeat. His team didn't make it out. He did. Sometimes he wondered if that was fair. After that, he'd left the core colonies where everything was clean and safe and predictable. He'd drifted toward the edges of human space, or the planets were rougher and the people asked fewer questions about your past. Billis 9 wasn't where he'd planned to stay. It was just supposed to be a stop along the way. But it had broken. Machines that needed fixing, and he was good with machines. Machines didn't judge you. They didn't ask why you woke up screaming sometimes. They just worked or they didn't. And if they didn't, Coop usually fixed them. His workshop was tucked away behind the main depot, in a space that had once been storage for a shipping company that went out of business years ago. It wasn't much to look at, cluttered with spare parts, greasy from years of repair work, and lit by lights that flickered when the power grid got overloaded. But he'd made it livable. He'd installed extra heaters and insulated the walls with strips of coolant foil he'd salvaged from old freighters. He'd rewired an old ship's power cord to keep the lights on and the heat running. He didn't need much space, just room for a cot, a kettle for making hot drinks, and his toolbox. After the accident, being alone had stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like safety. Alone meant predictable. Alone meant no one else could get hurt because of his mistakes. But now, watching the woman and child huddled in the snow across the alley, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd tried very hard to keep buried. It wasn't pity. Pity was useless and condescending. It wasn't responsibility either. He didn't owe these strangers anything. It was something more annoying than either of those things. It was his conscience, poking at him like a splinter under the skin that wouldn't stop hurting no matter how much he tried to ignore it. He watched as Corinne tried to stand up, her legs shaking with cold and exhaustion. She made it halfway before. Her strength gave out and she collapsed back to her knees. Her head bowed low, and for a moment she looked defeated. Then she lifted her face and looked directly at him through the crack in the door. She didn't blink. She didn't try to smile or look pitiful or do any of the things people usually did when they wanted something from you. She just looked at him, with eyes that had seen too much, and said, very quietly, "Please, we just want a warm meal." Her voice was rough and dry, like she hadn't had enough water to drink in days. But it was also strangely calm. It wasn't desperation. She'd moved past that stage weeks ago. This was resignation. These were words spoken not because she thought they might work, but because silence hadn't worked either, and she had to try something. Roger stood perfectly still behind his door. He didn't answer. He didn't nod or shake his head or give any sign that he'd heard her. Instead, he turned around and walked back into his workshop, his boots making soft sounds on the moody metal floor. Corrine watched him disappear into the shadows and felt her heart sink a little lower. Another person who couldn't be bothered. Another closed door. Another 30 seconds later, the workshop door hissed as it opened completely. Warm air rushed out into the cold alley like a flood, carrying with it the smell of machine oil and hot metal and something that might have been soup. Steam rose from an electric kettle sitting on a side table, mixing with the frigid air and creating little clouds. Roger stepped to one side of the doorway, said nothing, and left the entrance wide open. Corrine stared at the opening, not quite believing it was real. The warmth hit her face like a gentle slap, and she felt her frozen cheeks start to tingle as blood began to flow normally again. She looked down at Za, whose small legs were shaking so hard she could barely stand. Carefully, moving slowly because her joints were stiff with cold, Corrine picked up her daughter. Za was light too, light, because they hadn't been eating regularly, but Corine's arms were weak from cold and hunger. She held the child close and stepped through the doorway into the workshop. The heat hit them both like a wall. It was so different from the cold outside that Corine's knees almost buckled. She caught herself against the doorframe, then carefully set Za down on an overturned crate near one of the heaters. The little girl immediately held her hands out toward the warmth, her eyes wide with wonder at the sensation of not being cold. Roger still didn't speak. He moved around his workshop with the efficiency of someone who'd done the same tasks 1,000 times. He poured thick soup from a pot on a small heating unit into 2 metal bowls. The soup was made from processed meal, packs and whatever vegetables he could buy cheaply at the depot market. Not fancy, but hot and filling. He set the bowls on a low table near where Za was sitting, then dropped a spoon beside one of them with a small metallic clatter. "Eat," he said simply, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Start slow." Corrine moved first. Her hands were shaking as she reached for one of the bowls, and she had to grip it tightly to keep from dropping it. She held the spoon carefully to Za's lips. The little girl sipped the broth, then swallowed, her green eyes widening slightly as the warmth spread down her throat and into her empty stomach. Roger watched this small interaction quietly, his expression unreadable. When he was satisfied that Za was eating, he moved away to give them space. He walked to his workbench and sat down, picking up a circuit board that needed cleaning. He wiped it with a soft cloth, focusing on the delicate wires and connections, but he kept glancing over at his unexpected guests. Finally, Corrine lifted the spoon to her own lips. The taste was rough and artificial, clearly made from cheap ingredients and oversalted. But it was warm. It was real. It was food. And she hadn't had a proper meal in 3 days. She held the bowl tightly in both hands as if she were afraid someone might take it away from her. After a few minutes of eating in silence, Corrine set down her bowl and stood up slowly. She walked over to where Roger was working, still holding the bowl in one hand. With the other hand, she reached up toward the chest strap of her torn bodysuit, her fingers moving to unclasp it. It was reflex, not thought. In her world, nothing came for free. When someone helped you, they expected payment, and she only had one thing to trade. Her back straightened, her jaw locked, and her eyes went distant as she prepared to do what she'd had to do too many times before. "Don't," Roger said flatly, not even turning around from his work. Corrine stopped, her fingers frozen on the strap. Confusion flickered across her face. "You're not here for trade," Roger added, wiping a wire clean with careful precision. "You eat, you rest. That's all." Corrine stood perfectly still, her hands still raised. "I don't have anything else to offer," she said, her tone even and honest. Not defensive, not ashamed, just stating a fact. Roger finally glanced at her. "You already did," he said. "You asked for help." That's enough. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Roger stood up and walked to a metal locker against one wall. He pulled out a gray utility shirt, oversized and worn. but clean and warm. Then he grabbed a folded blanket from a shelf. "Put this on," he said, handing her the shirt. "Wrap the kid. You both sleep here tonight. I've got the bench." Corinne took the shirt and held it against her chest like it was something precious. She looked down at Za, who had finished about half her bowl of soup and was now curled up on the crate, drowsy from warmth and food. The little girl had tucked her fingers into the hem of her makeshift tunic, a habit she developed when she felt safe. "Thank you," Corinne said, her voice quieter than before. Roger didn't reply. He just went back to his tools, losing himself in the familiar work of fixing broken things. Za crawled onto the cot and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Her breathing slowed and deepened as real warmth soaked into her small body for the first time in days. "Mommy," she murmured sleepily. The warm man made the cold go away. Corinne sat beside her daughter on the edge of the cot, the utility shirt draped around her shoulders like a cape. Her white hair was still damp, but it was beginning to dry in the heated air. Her eyes remained fixed on Roger across the room. He didn't look up from his work, but she noticed that his own bowl of soup sat untouched beside his tools. That night, sleep came slowly. Not from comfort, the cot was narrow and the blanket thin, but from exhaustion, from silence. The simple miracle of being warm. Corinne didn't trust it yet. Part of her kept waiting for Roger to change his mind, to demand payment, to kick them back out into the cold. But she no longer feared waking up frozen. For the first time in months, that constant gnawing terror had loosened its grip. Outside, the sound of the storm had faded into a dull whisper. No more pounding wind, just a low vibration that seemed to come from the planet itself, as if Billis 9 was groaning under the weight of endless winter and the loneliness of forgotten people trying to survive on its surface. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cold remained. It always did. Roger Venn sat on his workbench, half awake, staring at drops of condensation that slid slowly down the side of his heater. His shoulders ached from sleeping on the hard metal surface, but it didn't matter. He wasn't used to sleeping well anyway. Nightmares had a way of finding you, no matter where you laid your head. Across the small workshop, the cot creaked gently as Za shifted under the blanket. Corinne sat upright beside her, fully awake. She hadn't slept at all. Her violet eyes were fixed on the narrow window, where layers of frost turned the outside, whirled into pale blue shapes that might have been buildings or might have been dreams. Her arms were wrapped around her daughter's small frame, holding her close. Some part of her still expected someone to pound on the door and tell them to leave. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, even when kindness stared her in the face. Roger stood and walked quietly across the room. He didn't say good morning. Pleasantries seemed ridiculous in a place like this. Instead, he crouched beside the cot and looked at Za. Something about her breathing didn't sound right. It was shallow and quick, like a small animal that had been running. "She's warm," Corinne said before he could ask the question. "Too warm." Roger hesitated, then gently pressed the back of his hand to Za's forehead. The little girl didn't stir. Her skin was hot and damp. "Fever," he said. Corinne nodded. "It started a day ago. She hasn't coughed yet, but her joints hurt. She cried all night before we came here." Roger stood up, his jaw tightening. "She needs medicine. I know." The words came out flat, defeated. "I tried at the depot clinic. They won't see non-registered Verlins. Not unless someone with citizenship signs for you." Roger didn't answer immediately. He leaned against his workbench, both hands pressed flat against the steel surface, staring at the far wall. The image of Corinne kneeling in the snow came back to him, how she'd said nothing at first, just waited with a dignity that most people lost long before they ended up begging in the street. "Maybe," he said finally, "I can get something. Know someone. Black market, trade posts near the loading tracks." Corinne looked at him directly. "What would you trade?" Roger's face hardened. "Parts, scrap, whatever. I have to." Will that be enough? It'll have to be. He grabbed his coat from a hook by the door, black leather, patched at the shoulders and reinforced with heating coils to keep the worst of the cold out. He strapped his multi-tool to his belt, then moved toward the door controls. Kareen stood. Up, let me go with you. Roger turned back sharply. No, she stepped forward. You won't get medicine for free. They see a human buying Varelen medicine, they'll triple the price or put a mark on your name. And if they see you with me, ... double quotes. She paused. They might decide I'm worth more than whatever you're offering to trade. Roger stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. You have a kid to protect, she continued. Something happens to you, who takes care of her, and who takes care of me? The logic was sound, even if he didn't like it. In places like Billis 9, logic was often the only thing that kept you alive. Added, let me handle this. She nodded reluctantly before stepping out. Roger reached into a drawer and handed her a sidearm. An old MK-17 hand pulse cracked near. It's a grip, but functional only if someone tries to come in. Don't flash 18. Use it unless... You have to. Kareen held it like someone who had been given a key to a locked door. She didn't believe. It's whatever open. Why are you doing this? Roger shrugged. Don't know. Yethi left outside the storm. It had died down, but the streets were quiet in a way. That felt wrong. Too many people had gone missing this week. Too many whispers about slavers making deals. With syndicates again, Roger moved fast past the transit yards down a gated freight path. He knew the contact brand. Malrek's ex-quartermaster turned. Scavenger Kingbrun ran his exchange from a repurposed cargo container. Behind a scrap pile, getting in wasn't the problem. Getting out with what you needed was. Back at the workshop, Kareen sat with Za. Again, Thegger's breathing had shifted no longer. Shallow but labored, her fingers twitched. She whimpered once in her sleep. Kareen took the utility shirt Roger had given her and soaked part of it in cool water from the corner, pressing it to her daughter's head. Her hands were steady, but her mind wasn't. This wasn't the first time she'd watched Za get sick. But before there were others, other castles, mothers, a medical shelter even. If they were cruel, they had structure here. Za was nothing. She looked around the bay again, crates stacked to the ceiling, tools hanging from chains, one cat, one lamp. It wasn't home, but it was dry and quiet, and Roger hadn't asked for anything. She didn't understand him. And that scared her more than if he'd tried to touch her outside hours past. When Roger returned, his coat was slashed and blood was seeping from a cut along his jaw, but he held a sealed dose pack in one hand and a grim expression on his face. Got it, he said. He handed her the injector. Use it now. 2 clicks thigh muscles. She didn't ask questions. She followed instructions. When it was done, she wrapped her daughter tighter and whispered to her in Varelen words Roger didn't recognize, but he understood the tone. Roger moved to the sink, washed the blood off, then wrapped a cloth around his arm. What happened? Kareen asked. Bran gave it to me. Roger said Thenon of his men followed me out and said they wanted more. I told him no, they'll come back probably. She looked at him, calm, tired, focused. You could still send us away before they do. Roger shook. Hish. They'll come whether you're here or not. If you leave, you'll die in the snow. If you stay, maybe you won't. He sat down. Zia stirred in her sleep, her breathing steadier for the first time since arriving. Kareen allowed her body to relax, not fully, but enough. She watched Roger. He didn't smile. He didn't look proud, just sat there holding Prez against his own wound. Why are you like this? She asked quietly. He met her eyes. Becca's. Someone once gave me a warm meal when I didn't ask that night. She didn't sit beside the cot. She sat closer to Thebinge, not touching him, but not far either. The next morning came slowly. Adelhaize clung to the workshop's reinforced windows. Outside, the storm had shifted into a gray, sleet, less violent than snow, but colder, somehow wetter, heavier. The colony's power grid had flickered overnight, enough for one of the heaters to fail in force. Roger to Jurig, a backup coil from an old rail battery. He hadn't slept again. Karen estered. First, she sat upright, blinking slowly, still wrapped in. Roger's shirth metal floor under her made her joints stiff, but her eyes darted straight to the cot. Za. The child was still breathing deeper now. The fever had broken. Her cheeks no longer flushed, deep violet, but had faded to their normal soft hue. Her brow was dry. Corinne let out a long, quiet breath. Like she'd been holding it all night. Roger didn't say anything when she looked over at him. Hugh was already up stripping broken capacitor housing off a damaged servet head. His jaw was bruised from the fight with Brand's man, but he'd cleaned and bandaged. The wound, his right knuckle was torn, and a line of dried blood stained at the edge of his wrist. I was going to ask if you slept, he said without looking up, but I already know Theans were. Corinne stood slowly, her muscles sore but functional. She poured a small amount of clean water from a plastic canister into the same dented bowl she'd eaten from 2 nights ago. Rinse her Facethin, did the same for her daughter. She's better. She said simply, "Yutha dose should hold, but she'll need another one in about 6 days. If we're still here?" Carrie's eyes narrowed faintly. "Do you expect us not to be?" Roger finally looked at her. His tone stayed neutral, but his words were, "Careful. I expect them to come back for what they think I owe them, and I expect thee won't knock first." He motioned to a stack of crates near the back wall. "That once falls hollow if it goes bad to Keith. Kid crawl through and wait until I give the all clear, or you hear nothing for 10 minutes, then leave." Corinne walked over and tested the crate panel. It opened with a soft click. Inside was a tight crawl space, just enough for Occult and an adult to press together, dark, insulated, lined with spare coolant tubes and sealant rolls. "You built this before we arrived," she said. Roger nodded. Didn't like company back then either. Her gaze lingered on him. "Why are you alone, Roger?" He paused, didn't answer immediately. She didn't press. Instead, she stepped closer and picked up a bundled strip of cloth, one of Za's foot wraps, still damp from the first night. She began rewrapping it. Slowly, carefully, her hands were efficient, experienced. "I had a crew." Roger said eventually on Gallant, a terraforming team mid-phase ice melt. "I was lead systems tech." Corinne listened without interrupting. "One of the sub-zero exhaust units failed chain reaction flash pressure breach, killed 6 of them. I survived, wasn't supposed to. My name got cleared, got offers to join new teams." His fingers tightened around the capacitor. "Take any of them, so you came here." "Yeah, this place doesn't ask much from an yon. Suits me." Karen's expression didn't change, but her tone softened. "You didn't run away." "I didn't stay either." That quiet settled between them. Again, not cold, just matter of fact. Za groaned gently and turned over in her sleep. Her body twitched, then relaxed. Corinne moved to the cot, brushed the hair from her daughter's face. "I was sold to the Outer Branch Caste Consortium when I was 15, she said without looking up. "Trained for fertility. Service, got assigned to a rotation of biters for 6 years. I conceived 3 times only. Za lived after the 3rd. They said I was failing expectations. They removed my status and deported me with my daughter. My record was marked unfit for programmatic reintegration." Roger didn't respond right away. He leaned against Thuriken's, arms crossed. "That's what they called it. They didn't say it to me. They stamped it on the papers they shoved in my hands while I was naked in a customs bay." More silence. Corinne finally looked at him. "You want to know why I didn't scream that night? Why I didn't beg harder?" Roger nodded. "Barely, because I already lived through begging, and I already learned it doesn't help." He didn't argue. Instead, he said, "There's a supply carrier docking in 3 days, small cargo hauler, mostly smuggled salve. If we can reach it, we might be able to get off this rock." Corinne stood slowly. "You'd leave?" Roger's voice was steady. "Not for me." She studied him, the exhaustion in his eyes, the roughness in his hands, the way he never asked questions unless it mattered. He had leather in without reason, risked his name to get medicine, fought men who might return in force. "You're not trying to save you, Sarah? You?" She asked. "No, I'm trying to make sure I don't have to bury any O'Neills." That struck her harder than she expected. Outside, a sudden thud, echo distant but heavy. Then a second closer. Roger moved, immediately shutting the heater off and signaling with 2 fingers toward the back crate. Corinne didn't hesitate. She scooped Zaya into Haram's blanket and all and crawled into the compartment, Roger. Slid the panel shut behind her. Then he stood and waited. Someone pounded on the bay door. Roger flexed his fingers once. Then walked toward it, boots silent on the metal floor. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a wrench and said calmly, "You picked the wrong damn time." The lights dimmed slightly, and the door began to open. The door opened with a low hydraulic groan, then stopped. Halfway jammed by Roger's manual, override a gust of sleep blew in, carrying with it the sharp smell of rust, oil, and cold sweat. 3 men stood just beyond the threshold, all locals, but not from the depot. They wore makeshift armor pieced at each other from plating and insulated coats stitched with red armbands, the kind Brand Mo used to mark his runners, one in front, broad shoulders. Shaven head visor goggles pushed to his brow, stepped forward and kicked the door hard. Enough to shake loose one of Roger's hanging tools. Then he called out, "We had a deal." Roger didn't move from the bench. The wrench in his hand stayed low, just hanging like it belonged to their ray brought. "You scrap," he said calmly. The man stepped in. "You brought tech scrap for high dose." Antiviral, his boots clunked against the metal floor. Brand says, "That's not even close." To fair, Roger didn't answer. His eyes flicked once. Checking's crate. Panel still closed, still undisturbed. Behind the enforcer, another man came in, thinner, wiry. He had a baton clipped to his belt and a superset pistol slung across his chest, casual. The third stayed outside, blocking the alley. "What do you want?" Roger asked. "Payment," the bald one. "SAID retroactive," or the girl Roger's voice flattened. "No deal was made for people she's cast, discarded, nor registration, no record. She's not people in this district." Roger took a step forward. "Then you're in the wrong district." The second man moved to flank him, eyes scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the cot, then the empty food bowls. "She's still here," he said with a smirk. "You're sheltering fugitives." Now, the bald one added, "Not fugitives." Roger replied, "Refugees." The second man stepped closer. Same difference to Bran. There was a pause, tight, thin, brittle. Then the bald one reached for his baton. Roger moved. First, the wrench caught the man's wrist, mid-draw bone, cracked. The weapon clatter at the second enforcer. Lunged, but Roger grabbed him by the coat and slammed him into the support beam beside the heater, rattling the entire unit. The third, still outside, rushed in, but tripped on the threshold as Roger threw the second man into his path. Fists hit steel. A tool rack came down. A heater sparked. Kareen heard all of it from the dark. She held Zia against her chest, breath frozen, heart hammering. Then came the worst sound, silence. 10 seconds, 20. Then footsteps. The crate panel hissed open just a crack. Roger's voice low and firm. "He's out. It's safe." Kareen crawled out, still holding Zaya. She looked past him. One man lay unconscious, face down, nose broken. Another groaned near the bench, blood leaking from his ear. The third was gone, fled, or worse. Roger wiped his mouth, blood smeared across his palm. "They're going to come back," Kareen said quietly. "Not soon." He replied, "I made sure." Her eyes scanned the damage. "You're bleeding." He shrugged. "Better me than you." She looked at him, really looked, and the full weight of the moment hit her. He could have turned them in, could have walked away. Instead, he fought off 3 armed men with nothing but tools and a bad attitude, and now he stood in front of her chest, heaving, blood drying at his temple, like none of it mattered. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." She said, Zod down gently on the cot. The child stirred but didn't wake. Fever gone, pulse strong, warm. Then Kareen turned back to Roger. She stepped in close, her fingers still shaking, reached up and touched his jaw softly, just under the bruise. "Hadn't flinch. You keep doing things that don't make sense," she whispered. He met her eyes. "You want me to stop?" She shook her head. Then slowly she leaned in and pressed her forehead to his. "Not an offer, not a transaction, just contact, real human." He stayed still. She let her hand rest against his neck. His skin was warm, rough, alive. "I've never awed Somion like this." She said, "You don't." He replied, "That's the point." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. Not entirely, but enough to stay that night. She curled up on the cobby side, her arms stretched behind her fingertips, resting just inches from the Bench where Roger sat in silence, listening to the storm. Return outside, neither of them spoke again, but neither of them slept alone. Son Newton the following morning was silent to silent, no. Knocking, no shouts, no engine rumble from the depot, just a blanket of gray over the colony. It was the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like something was building beneath it. Roger is the first to stir. He sat hunched at the edge of his workbench, one boot on the floor, the other resting on a half-crushed tool crate. His jaw still ached from a hit, and his knuckles were swollen, but he'd cleaned the wounds. The worst was already scabbing across the room. Za coughed softly. It was the first sound she'd made in nearly a full day. He looked over. Corinne was curled around her daughter, protectively, one arm across the child's chest. Her eyes were closed. Butch wasn't asleep. Her body was too alert, too rigid. She was listening, breathing slow, trying not to show it. Za stirred again, then whispered, "Mommy?" Corinna panned her eyes at once and shifted closer. "I'm here." The girl blinked up at her, voice small. "Did the loud men go away?" Corinne brushed her fingers through her daughter's tangled white hair. "They're gone." Za nodded once slowly, then her eyes drifted toward Roger. She stared at him for a long time before speaking again. "Hamat them go." Roger offered a faint smile. "I made them leave." "Yeah." Za's mouth moved, like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she ducked her face into her mother's shoulder. "She's remembering too much," Corinne said softly. "She always does after someone raises their voice." Roger didn't comment. Instead, he stood and walked to the heating unit. He turned up the dial until the coils glowed orange. Thon moved to the far crate, where he pulled out the last sealed ration pack. "I'll cook something," he said. "You both need real food." Corinne looked around. "You're running low." "I know." He didn't offer more. He heated the pack, added water, stirred in powdered vegetables, thin but hot. He poured a third into a separate bowl, smaller, and set it gently near Zaya. The girl sat up slowly, still bundled in her blanket. Her hands reached for the bowl, but hesitated. Corinne lifted spoon, tested the temperature, then gave it to her. So took a bite, chewed quietly, and nodded once with approval. "She likes it." Corinne said. "She has low standards." Roger muttered. Za gave a tiny smile. It was the first time Roger had seen it after the meal. Roger started repairing the servo joint that had been knocked off the wall during the Fifth workshop. Bore the marks of the scuffle, blood streaks, a bent beam, a cracked lamp. But nothing permanent. Still, it made him uneasy. If Brand's men didn't come back today, they would soon, and next time they wouldn't knock. Corinne helped clean quietly, methodically. She didn't ask for direction, didn't speak unless necessary. She found a missing bolts, picked up shattered glass with a rag, realigned the heater that had come loose at one point. Roger caught her staring. "Aft door. You want to leave?" Kay said no. She replied, "I want to know if you still want us to. I didn't ask you to stay, but you didn't tell us to go." He tightened a bolt. "I meant what?" I said, "You're not a debt. Then why are you preparing to die for us?" He didn't answer. She didn't press that night. Roger was working late, recalibrating the backup generator, when he noticed the faint blinking light on the terminal near the main door. "Incoming file request, unauthorized signal trace." He froze. Theno pinged the log. Someone had pinged the systems ID marker twice. Not from Theotepo, not from Brandsman. A colony-wide query, civil registration scan. He Tornado. Corinne immediately. "Did you ever register when you arrived?" She shook her head. "They wouldn't let me." Said, "I had no sponsor." "Then you're officially unlisted, which makes me a ghost." Roger checked Thetaminal again. The trace was partial, not yet direct, but close. Someone was trying to map heat signatures, looking for non-human thermal profiles, probably part of sweep government. Corinne asked worse. Roger muttered, "Corporate buyer Lamation Clipe crew." Her face went pale. "That means they're not here for justice ether. Here to erase anyone without a profile. You and Za are a threat on paper." "What do we do?" He paused, then look at the old cargo sled. Buried beneath spare paneling, heavy low profile, designed for hauling illegal salvage through Coal Jones. "We leave." When he looked back at her, serious. Now Corinne didn't hesitate, turned, gathered Zaya, still half asleep, and wrapped her in both blankets. Argasius Rager. Threw open the false crate. Inside was the modified sled, long, dark, padded. With insulation foam, he opened the cavity beneath it and fitted the pulse battery. Get in, you'll both fit. If there's oven tube, it'll keep air flowing. What about you? I'll push. It halfway then met you at the harbor, Roger. I know this place better than they do, but you need to go now. Za looked up from her mother's arms. You're coming to Warman? Roger crouched beside her. I'll be there soon. Ibrahim Zaya reached out and touched his cheek. You're not like the others, Roger Dodden. Know what to say to that, so he nodded and closed the sled door behind them as the lights flickered. Signaling the start of another grid scan, he turned toward the front gate wrench in one hand. Data stick in the other, Huos ready, but this time he wasn't just protecting a guest, he was protecting his people. The harbor zone was less a port and more a rusted sprawl of forgotten cargo decks and hefty commission freighters. The outer sectors were unguarded, but that didn't mean safe. Corporate reclamation teams had moved. In be nightfall, quiet, efficient, and armed with scanners designed to sweep entire blocks in seconds. They weren't soldiers, they were cleaners, and they didn't take prisoners. Roger moved fast, keeping to the side tunnels he had mapped the area weeks ago. While scourging for usable coils now, every corridor felt shorter, tighter-less, forgiving. He paused near a grated access hatch and keyed in a sequence on a hand held the sled. Concealed beneath a stack of industrial tarps, responded with a faint vibration inside. Corrine clutched so tightly as the sled glided across the cold floor, silent. Guided by Rogers' remote commands, it wouldn't pass a heat scan. It barely masked a human presence. Had maybe 10 minutes. Before patrols crossed this quadrant inside the sled, Zoe whispered, "Why is it so quiet?" Corrine hushed her gently. "We're almost there." The girl nodded. "I'm not scared if you're holding me." Outside, Roger stepped around the corner and froze to figures in dark coats. Rifles slung low were scanning the cargo lane just ahead. Ear bore the mark of the Veltrax Brelamation Division, a division Informouse for recovering biological assets. Outside their licensing zones, Verlin Castales-like. Corrine weren't seen as citizens. They were treated as unclaimed property, worth money, disposable. Roger ducked behind a container. Stack pulled a small disruptor from his belt, a tool, not a weapon, but enough to fry a scanner close range. He tapped once in his comm stick, pinging the sled too slow, but then a voice rang out, female. Cold professional Thoral irregularity moving north lane, confirming they'd seen it. Roger didn't think. He sprinted across the deck, burst from cover, and activated the disruptor signal. Spiked. One of the enforcers turned too late. The scanner unit on Hishep sparked, overloaded. What? The second officer swung his rifle. Roger slammed into him, shoulder first. They both hit the ground hard. The rifle clattered away. Alarms triggered instantly, not loud. Just a red strobe pulsing at the edges of the deck. More wild come from a sled. Corrine heard the impact. Then saw him, Roger, fighting on the deck with two larger men, one trying to stand, the other drawing a blade. Shadn't wait. She opened the sled, manually set, stowed down behind the nearest support clumb, and ran. Her feet hit the deck with precision. Her body moved fast, too fast for someone who'd nearly collapsed. In the snow days ago, she reached the second officer just as he drew the Bladian, slammed his head into the wall once, twice. He went limp. Roger looked up at her, breathing hard, bloody lips split again. "I told you to stay hidden, you said. We're not a death, so stop treating me like one." He stared at her just for a second, and something shifted. Then they heard it, boots for maybe 5 men approaching from the east lane. Roger grabbed her hand. "We move now?" They ran together, ducking through the industry line toward the outbound crawler platform. Zaya, hearing them, peeked from behind, the pillar eyes wide but calm. Roger swept her up with one arm and didn't stop. They reached the crawler, an old transport rig barely holding together its engine. Cold. Roger Jamed's panel bypassed the lock and dumped them inside. He sealed the hatch, then climbed to the cabin and started the ignition sequence. Nothing dead. Karen itched beside him, pulled an old ignition coil from her coat, salvaged from his bench earlier. "You're welcome." Roger snapped it in the engine, sputtered, then roared to life. They didn't wait. The crawler jolted forward, wheels screaming against the metal deck as Roger pushed Shedzy throttle behind them. Lights flashed, voices called. Someone fired. But Thebluk of the crawler absorbed the shots. They crashed through the perimeter gate and hit the icy terrain. Beyond Thay Harbor, the crawler's lights cut through mist and snow inside the wind. Howled through the cracks, Za clung to Kareen, her voice. Muffled in her mother's chest-in, she whispered, "We're still together, right?" Roger looked back from the cabin, eyes locking with Kareen. She didn't answer immediately. She reached forward and pulled. Za closer between them, then rested her free hand. Over Roger's on the throttle. "Yes," she said, "we are." The crawler moved forward into the white wasteland. They had no map, no beacon, but they had each other, and no one would take that again. 2 days passed. The crawler broke down outside the Habzanarim. Its coolant lines frozen and cracked from overuse. Roger had expected it wouldn't last far beyond the harbor. It had only needed to get them far enough, and it had they pushed the rest of Theway on foot, skirting the edge of the abandoned geothermal mining corridor that stretched beneath the cliffs. Thorn was different out here. Still brutal, still cold, but quieter. No patrol drones, no flashlights cutting through snow, no voices barking orders through loudspeakers, just a hiss of ice-shifting gunder. Their Bootsua was wrapped in both blankets, tucked tight against Kareen's chest as she trudged forward her steps. Heavy controlled, Roger stayed close, one hand on Kareen's back, Theatha holding a repurposed tool. Turn blade in case anything moved where it shouldn't. At dusk, they reached it. A half-collapsed power substation wedged between two natural ridges. It's forgotten infrastructure from Verilus 9's first colonization cycle. The entrance was narrow and iced over, but the interior still retained heat. Roger forced the hatch, cut the manual. Override and guided them inside. It wasn't much concrete floor stripped wiring, a generator that hadn't run in a decade, but it was shelter. Kareen sat Za down on a pile of bundled cloth Roger had carried in his pack. The girl stirred briefly, then curled up without protest, her breath and why steady, her skin warm. She was safe. Kareen sat down slowly, her legs buckly beneath her before she meant them to, and Roger caught her just before she hit Thefler. He lowered her the rest of the way, kneeling beside her. His hands hovered near her shoulders, unsure, then settled. She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red from wind and exhaustion. Her voice came out low. "You didn't have to come this Farrager." Shook his head. "Yeah, I did." Why? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached up and gently brushed the frost from her cheek, his fingers trailing the edge of her jaw for a long moment. Neither of them moved. Then she leaned in, not cautious, not shy. She pressed her forehead to his, the same way she had once before, but this time her lips followed a slow, soft touch, not desperate, not transactional. Just real. His arms went around her, holding her not to possess, but to keep her steady. Her body relaxed against his. She didn't shake a no more when they finally pulled back. Kareen whispered, "You're not like any man I've ever known." Roger replied, "I'm not trying to be." They stayed close, sharing heat in the half-dark, their bodies resting against each other, breaths slowing in rhythm. There was no need for more words. Everything that mattered had already been spoken without speaking later, after a meal of dry rations and melted snow. Roger rechecked the sled's data module, the outbound ping they'd launched from the harbor had gone through. A reply had come back encrypted, but unmistakable. It was from an old contact, a technician who owed Roger a favor. A small transport was en route. Tequiat. No questions. 3 ceased departure in 2 days. When Kareen heard, she didn't smile. She simply nodded, took his hand and said, "We won't be running anymore after this." Roger didn't correct her. Zia stirred in her sleep again, then mumbled, barely awake, "Are we home?" Kareen looked over at Roger. He met her eyes. "If you wanted to be." Kareen laid back down beside her daughter, hands still resting in Roger's. Her body softened. In his sleep, for the first time in what felt like months, Roger stayed awake a while longer. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was because, for the first time, he didn't feel alone, as frost settled on the old substation roof and silence reclaimed the frozen ridge. One last voice cut through the quiet. Za, sleepy but certain, whispered, "Warm man, you belong to us now." Roger didn't reply, he just smiled closed his eyes and finally slept. The frost had long retreated from the southern basin of Varelus Nine's abandoned ridge sector. Spring, such as it was on this fractured colony world, came not with flowers, but with steady weather, thaw pipes, and the hum of working systems that no longer threatened to fail with every gust of wind. The small homestead Roger had built stood just beyond that tree line of a geothermal outflow powered by a buried generator. Salvaged from the substation, it was simple metal siding, insulated walls, a working stove, but it was theirs inside. Warmth filled the room. Za sat on the floor beside a low table, carefully assembling something from scrap, a little toy made of broken circuit plates and wire. Her hands moved with care. She was humming softly a tune she'd learned from Kareen. Roger sat nearby, wiping his hands clean after repairing the solar relay. Outside, his beard was fuller now, his face a little more relaxed. He still moved like a man expecting things to fall apart, but less often now, less guarded. The door to the back room slid open with a soft hiss. Kareen stepped out barefoot on the warm metal floor, wrapped in a soft gray robe that clung loosely to her body. Her long white hair had grown thicker, tied in a low braid. Her eyes held that same quiet intelligence, but softened. Now no fear, no tension, and resting her hands over herbally, now clearly rounded, she looked at Roger. He stood you all right. Heast, stepping to her without hesitation, she nodded slowly, then let his hand rest on her side. She's kicking more. Kareen said. Roger's brow lifted. Karen smirked faintly. Zay is certain, she said. It has to be his sister, so I can teach her not to be scared of snow. Roger let out a quiet breath and leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. I never thought I'd have this, she whispered. A home, a child born for love, not Ordursh's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. You deserve all of it. She looked up at him. So do you. From the corner, zackled out Mom. Roger, I made her a toy. It's out legs and everything. Karen mauled. Bring it here, sweetheart. As they rushed over, cradling the crude little creature in her hands, Roger stepped back and let them both sit beside Kareen on small padded bench. The three of them huddled close, surrounded by warmth, the scent of steamed bread baking from the stove, and the quiet hum of peace outside. Wind no longer howled inside. Everything felt settled. And as the evening lights dimmed and Za drifted to sleep between them, Kareen whispered into Roger's chest, she'll be born in safety with a name we choose. And Roger, arms around both of them, replied with Theanly words that mattered. She'll be born free.